All right, well, it's good to be back with you guys. Didn't lose too many after pizza, just taking the meal and running home. It's great to be with you once again. That was epic hearing from Jordan. That was, I think, way more intellectual than I'll be able to go. What I'm going to try to focus on in this time is, all right, let's even say I felt confident I had answers for some of these questions. How would I go about having conversations with friends practically about these things? Does that even happen? Does anyone still become a Christian nowadays? Does that ever really happen, that someone comes from a background where they didn't grow up in a church and yet come to see that the Christian faith is true, as Jordan said? One thing I hid from you all in my bio is that I'm actually American. Tough thing to say nowadays. True nonetheless. But one of my favorite things about being an American in Canada is asking Canadians, what does it mean to be a Canadian? What does that mean to you? And every year, the Toronto Star does an article around Canada Day, and they ask a bunch of everyday average Canadians that question. So I just want to read a few that they had this year. Sarah Han, who's a second-generation Canadian whose parents immigrated from Korea, said that for her, being Canadian is like being a part of a good family. You can be honest with your family about who you really are, and if the family is rooted in love and respect, then everyone finds a way to embrace you and move forward together. And then everyone eats. Like that, eating. Jasmeet Sidhu, who's a devoted Sikh, said that being Canadian means being indefinable. How do you like that, Canadians? You are indefinable. What does it mean to be Canadian? We're indefinable. I like that. The fact that there is no prototypical Canadian, that a newcomer can come to Canada and be in love with this country as much, if not more, than a fourth-generation Canadian. I just want to read one more to you. Canadians see Canada as the place where one complains about ice and snow, but remember, part of our Canadian identity is we always see the other side of every point. Snow and ice also mean skiing, hockey, snowmobiling, and tobogganing. So what I'm thinking is, if you took a random grouping of human beings from Earth, and you found some who were polite, accepting, they could stand the cold, they might be Canadian. Well, what do you know? And at the Bible passage we'll be looking at this evening, Jesus is saying what it means to be a true Christian. Someone who has a radical new relationship with God through faith in the gospel. It means that you'll be salt and light. If you're Canadian, you'll be polite and accepting. Jesus says if you're a Christian, you'll be salt and light. And we'll be looking at what does that mean. I want to start by looking at salt. This is Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. Now you might know, in this culture, when Jesus is talking about salt, he's not talking about flavor so much as preservation. He's not saying Christians are the Tabasco sauce of the world. He's actually talking about something more like refrigerators. Right? This is 2,000 years ago, no refrigeration. How do you keep fruit? How do you keep meat fresh? You put salt on it. It preserves it. Jesus is saying the impact that Christians should have on the world, on a family, on a neighborhood, on a school, is like that of salt in its impact on meat. It keeps it from going bad. And we find in this passage that this effect is contingent on two things. First, on presence. Salt has to be in contact. And I think Jesus, as he always does, walks the walk and doesn't just talk the talk. I love this Middle Ages picture because here we have Jesus healing Lazarus, pulling him out of the tomb. He's been dead for 3 days. Remember, they don't even want Jesus to open up the tomb because they're afraid he's going to smell bad. And I love the honesty. Here's the poor guy who got the job of unwrapping Lazarus. But this is what Jesus does. Jesus goes to smelly places and deals with ugly things. We could think of Jesus in the way he doesn't just heal lepers. He touches them. He touches people with skin disease. He reaches into brokenness and decay. It's contingent on presence. That's how salt works. But it's also contingent on purity. He's saying, Christians, if you're a Christian, you'll be a salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Now, I have a Greek lesson for you. There is actually one word for this whole phrase, lost its taste. Some translations it says loses its saltiness. The Greek word is the Greek word moron, which is where we get the English word moron, which means to be a moron. It means to be totally useless. And now my science friends, like Jordan, might tell me that salt actually cannot go bad chemically. Remember, high school chemistry, sodium chloride, NaCl, actually does not go bad, ever. The only way salt can spoil is if it has impurities mixed in with it. And when that happens, we see Jesus even talking about it. The reason why he says we need to throw it on the road, remember, this is not Canada. It's not because of snow. Something's going on. The reason is when salt goes bad, you can't even just dump it in your backyard because it will kill literally everything. You dump it on a patch of grass, and that patch of grass is going to be dead until Jesus comes back and raises the dead to life, because that's what salt does. When it's bad, it kills things. Jesus is saying when salt gets impure, it's not just useless, it's toxic. It kills things. And yet, Jesus is saying, this is what it means to be a Christian, is that you'll have the effect of salt, but it will be a pure salt. We've talked about this verse a lot tonight. What is apologetics? What does it mean to give a defense to the Christian faith? Sometimes we can leave out the first sentence, the first step. Let's say you say, I want to be more bold sharing my faith. I want to know how to have these conversations. I want to talk like Jordan. What do I do? First step, Peter tells us, actually has nothing to do with what you say. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy. This is the first step Jesus calls us to as we share our faith. We need to have our hearts given to God first. Essentially what Jesus is saying, what Peter is saying, is that people filter the words of our mouth through the integrity of our lives. People will be looking. They're always looking. It's never just what we say. It's always seen through what we do. I think the clearest example of this happened towards the beginning of the Christian church. You might remember Israel, within the Roman Empire at the time. The Christian faith starts to expand. Judea, Samaria, reaches into Africa and Asia, and finally Europe. Most of this is in the Roman Empire. And then, of course, lo and behold, 300 years later, we have the Roman Emperor Constantine becoming a Christian. Groundbreaking. But there were emperors after Constantine who didn't share the Christian faith. And this was the last Roman emperor who wasn't a Christian, Julian. And he was rooting for what he calls, he was rooting for the pagan religions of old. And what he calls atheism here, he's actually talking about Christianity, because Christians didn't believe in all the gods that the Romans believed in, so he considered them Christians. But what's so interesting, here's what he says about why Christianity grows. He says, atheism, Christianity, has been specially advanced through the loving service rendered to strangers and through their care for the burial of the dead. It is a scandal that there is not a single Jew who is a beggar, and that the godless Galileans, the Christians, care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well, while those who belong to us look in vain for the help that we should render them. Now, what he is essentially saying about Christians is, I don't believe what they believe. In fact, I disagree with it. I find it reprehensible. It's culturally reprehensible. I just have issues with it, and yet I'm so glad they're here. Can you imagine if people thought that way about Christians today? Think of all the circles we're in. Each of us is in a family. We're in a school. We're on a sports team. Can you imagine if people knew what you believed and said, I so disagree with what you believe as a Christian, but I'm so glad you're here, because the love that you have for this community changes it. Can you imagine if we were known for our love like that? Jesus doesn't just say we should aspire to this. Jesus says, if you're a Christian, you'll begin to look this way. You'll begin to think about the people in your community, and you'll be thinking about, why am I here? What does it mean to be known like this? I disagree with you so deeply, but I'm so glad you're here. Jesus says if we're a Christian, we'll start to look like salt. People will filter the words of our mouths through the deeds of our lives. We're also talking here about lights. Let's read on the next verse, 14. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but they put it on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Now, in the Bible, this word light is very often associated with hope. And to illustrate this, I have to go to this scene. This is from The Lord of the Rings. Any Lord of the Rings fans here, please? You can, no shame. Raise your hand. Lord of the Rings fans. Shame on you. Shame. No, I'm just kidding. I love that. I love the movie. One of my favorite movies. And this is one of my favorite scenes. So I'm just going to, if you haven't seen it, I'm just going to lose you in the details. But I love it, so I'll do it anyway. This Last movie, the main city, Minas Tirith, under attack. Pippin, who's a hobbit, the youngest of the company of the nine, who set out on this adventure, he gets assigned this task of climbing up the side of a building to light this giant torch. Remember, Lord of the Rings, no electricity back then. Not that it really happened, but it didn't have electricity. All right, and why is he doing that? Well, Gandalf, Dumbledore, except Gandalf, wizard, Lord of the Rings style, he gets Pippin to climb up the tower. Why? To light this torch. Why? Because the city is surrounded by Sauron's armies and these orcs, these evil creatures, right? So what? Well, the king refuses to light the beacons. Why would he light the beacons? Well, it signals to their allies that they need help. But the king's refusing to ask for help, so Gandalf gets Pippin to sneak on up there and lights this torch. And there's this powerful scene. It's called the lighting of the beacons. And they light their torch over here, and then on a mountain peak far away, you see another one light. They saw the signal. And then another one across the valley, and they're sending this signal across the mountains to their allies that can come and rescue them. And they do, and they bring deliverance. And during this scene, Gandalf says this powerful line. He says, "Hope is kindled." This is the association. Light brings hope. This certainly holds the case in the Bible as well. But just like the salt's effect is contingent, it has to be pure, it has to be present. We have to be there. The light also is contingent on something. Verse 16, the light has to shine. And apparently we have control over it. Why else would Jesus say, let it shine? Apparently we have the option to not do that. I just want to think about, what does that actually look like? Let's say you're in high school. Let's say you're in university. What does it actually look like to, shine, Jesus, shine? But what does that look like? How can I actually live that out? First thing I want to talk about is that fishing is not the same as hunting. I'm particularly interested in the animals involved here. Think of this. That's the deer I'm hunting, but a fish I'm fishing. When you hunt for an animal, what do? We're thinking about evangelism here, so have that in mind. You identify the animal. You're like, I see the deer. And then you're like, I'm going to kill that deer. You've singled it out. And with evangelism, sometimes we can be like, I want to share my faith with this person. They're going to become a Christian because I'm going to hunt them. I'm going to shoot them. I'm going to get them. And we just zoom in like that. But that is not how evangelism is in the Bible. What we're really talking about here is fishing. What is the difference? How do you fish? You fish by putting out bait. And you see what comes. You see the difference there. One is, I've identified this person, because essentially we have to remember that the people who come to Christ, that's not in our control. We're called to be faithful. Jesus says, no one comes to me unless the Father draws him. What we're called to do is to put out bait. Now, what does that actually look like? Honestly, if I'm speaking of my own life, and I imagine maybe some of you are in this case as well, when I'm with my non-Christian friends, I just naturally censor out the Christian parts of my life. Let's just say someone asks me tomorrow, what did you do last night? I'm here tonight. What did you do last night? I might just sort of scramble and be like, because I went to church, but I don't know if I want to tell them I went to church because they might feel weird, right? And so I might say, I brushed my teeth. I don't know, I did do that. Well, I hope I will do that. Or sometimes we say, what'd you do this weekend? And you're like, or what'd you do? Yeah, how was your Sunday? And you could be like, I went to Canadian Tire, it was awesome. But what if the best part of your day, let's say that you are going through a rough time. You went to church. Something reminded you about, even though you don't know where God is, he's still faithful to you now. If that was the best part of your weekend, don't make something up. But if that's really what happened, why would we not want to share that just naturally? As Christians, I think it's sometimes we do want to be forward about our faith because we want to see people come to Christ because we think this is true and it's powerful, makes a difference. And yet, I think so often what we don't even do is just be open about the reality of the role of faith in our life. Do your friends know that you're Christians? Would they, if you ask them, would they actually know that? What it means when you put out bait, maybe someone will say, oh, you said you went to church. That's weird. And they're not going to bring it up again. But maybe, I don't know, maybe God is doing a work in their life. Maybe they're going through something difficult, and they might then come to these tough questions. But how are they going to do that unless they know that you're a Christian? How can we let the light shine? We have to let people know. So many times we hunt, we decide to go in evangelism mode instead of just fishing. Think about this verse again. This is the core verse on evangelism that we're looking at. Be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. But see, this assumes that people are asking you. Sometimes I wonder, why aren't more people asking these questions? Maybe you're like, I've done my homework. I'm ready for this one. Come on, ask me a question. But no one asks me. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about here, what Peter's talking about here is people should be seeing the light in you. They should be seeing a glow. That might need to be through just words of expressing, are you talking about the role of faith in your life? Or it might need to be through seeing you as someone who's different. They see in your character. But it really should be the lives we live and the words we choose that stimulate these conversations. But what about when we have these conversations? How can you have a civil conversation about a topic like sexuality or tolerance or something like that? It just seems Christians, like, how do we even talk about that? And I think the piece of advice that we get from here is that we need to think about always answering a person and not a question. What do I mean by that? Going back to this verse in 1 Peter 3, he tells us, make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that you have. What Peter is concerned with, he's not saying give a defense, give an answer to a question. He's saying give an answer to a person. That every question has a questioner behind it. So we might think of something. Have you ever been asked a question about suffering? I think that's one of the things that comes up so often. It came up in the video there. But whenever someone asks you about suffering, that's just one of those questions where it's like, very often there's a reason why this person is asking. It's not just an intellectual question. There's a person behind the question that's there. And what I find so often I'm asking right away for a lot of these questions, maybe intolerance or a question on sexuality, is just to say, may I ask why you asked that question? Because that will totally dictate the way the conversation should go. Because imagine that someone asks you about suffering. Why would a good God allow suffering? And you say, may I ask you why you asked that? And they say, because my mother's in the hospital. And I'm not sure she's going to survive. You know what? In that case, if someone shares something like that, it's like, they're probably not looking for the philosophical answer. They want to hear you say, I'm so sorry to hear that. How are you doing? Can I pray for you? It might be the case, though, that you ask someone and they say, I'm a philosophy major, and I'm doing a unit on suffering, and evil. Then in that case, it might be, might have a different conversation there. But what Peter is concerned about is that there's always a person behind the question. It's so easy to have these conversations, and we can win the arguments and lose the person. I won. I was right. My points were there. My logic was sound tight. His wasn't. What Peter is concerned about, what Jesus is concerned about, how can we glow unless we're actually drawing people near? We want to win people and not arguments. And I think a way that we can do this practically is by thinking about this, what I call majoring in the majors. That's a baseball thing, but you guys have a baseball team, and they're very good. So you guys know what that means. Major in the majors, just in the sense of get to what's important. That's the big leagues. Try to get to that. And I put here Jesus, or thinking about the gospel. Because the thing is, with a lot of these questions, we can have such an intellectual debate. When I speak with a Muslim friend about the Trinity, we could talk about the philosophical, intricacies there, and there might be a place for that. But very often, we can waste so much time talking about details or showing how much knowledge we have without getting to the gospel, because we forget. We can lose our sight. We can think that these questions, this is what I need to focus on. But I think really the way that we need to think about this is these are obstacles we want to clear so people can see Christ. So let's take, for instance, a question of the Trinity. I have a lot of conversation with Muslim friends about this question. How can you, well, one, the Trinity doesn't make sense. 3 and 1, which one is it? Or why are you talking to me about eggs or ice or steam or and so it's like, and of course I want to answer their question, but I also want them to see what's beautiful about the Trinity. And I think that's the case with all these issues. So let's just take the Trinity. I found Nabil Qureshi, who's written this book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, phenomenal book about his own journey from a Muslim background coming to Christ. And I find he has, he sort of finally figured out, he's like, I wish that a Christian had explained it to me like this. And I think it can be helpful even if it's not perfect, because God it's mysterious. It's hard to talk about God. I think right away when we think about the Trinity, some Muslims might be quick to say, or maybe a lot of Christians, this word isn't in the Bible. Why is it part of the Christian faith? It's not even in the Bible. And I think similarly, though, we can ask, well, let's talk about the Islamic conception of God, that God is, we have this doctrine of tawheed, God's oneness. God is so utterly one through and through. It's blasphemous. It's demeaning of us to think of God being divided in three. But interestingly, this word tawheed is also, it's not found in the Quran. It's a doctrine that's derived from what the Quran teaches. And yet it's not, the word itself is not there. And that's the same way with the Trinity. The reason why Christians believe in a Trinity is because we see God revealing himself in Scripture in three ways. He's the creator, Father. He's the Redeemer, the Son. He's the sustainer, and he's present with us, Spirit. And what Nabil found is helpful to think about this is in terms of asking who and what questions. So just imagine that someone comes up to me, let's see, I'm meeting you after tonight, and let's say you ask me, who are you? And I'm like, all right, I'm Logan. That's how I'm going to answer that who question. But let's say you ask me, what are you? What are you? I might say, well, I'm a human being. What's going on there? See, the question of who, that's a question of personhood. I'm going to answer with my name. I'm Logan. But if you ask me what I am, that's a question on the level of being. I'm a human being. So when it comes to the person of God, when we ask God, who are you? We find God gives us three answers. I am Father, I am Son, I am Spirit. I'm the Holy Spirit. When we ask God the what question, what is your being, what is your essence? The answer is one, God. God, what are you? God. That is God's divine essence. And since when we think of, is this contradiction? Contradiction is something that's like 3 in 1. If God were 3 in 1 in the same sense, if he were 3 just like he's 1, that would be a contradiction. But when it comes to the person of God, he's 3 persons, but he's one being. So we could spend all day talking about that, sharing that with my Muslim friend, but I want to show him not just that this makes sense, but that it's beautiful and that it points to the gospel. And one way to think about this, you've got maybe some Arabic speakers in here. You might know that one of the 99 names of Allah is that he is Al-Wadud. He is the loving one. And Muslims have a strong view of God's greatness, and they would very much say the qualities that God has, he has to the greatest level. And so when we think about God's love, they would say, Allah is fully loving, as the greatest possible love that there could possibly be. And I would want to say, let's talk about that. What does it mean to love? Part of the definition of love is that it has to be 2 people, 2 beings, right? You can't have a very deep kind of love just by yourself. That may be like a kind of self-love, and we wouldn't really see that as that attractive. You need to have another person to love. So let's talk about how Allah and the God of the Bible fit that question. Allah, a monadic God, a God who is purely one. The only time he could start loving someone is when there were more than one entity, more than one being, more than one person. So maybe he could create a world and then begin to be loving towards that world. But before that, he can't have that characteristic. We can't say that Allah is love in his essence. Whereas in the Christian faith, we can say what it means for God to be Trinity is that he is 3, in his very essence, he is a relationship of 3 people infinitely loving and giving themselves sacrificially to one another. What this means is that God in the Bible doesn't just start loving when he creates. It's actually part of who God actually is. When we say God is love, we take that for granted, we throw that around in his very essence, but someone reading, just coming from a background in Islam, couldn't say that's in God's essence. It's a quality that describes him, perhaps, after he creates. But when we're talking now about, this Trinity, sometimes Christians, we feel we need to be embarrassed of this. And it's not just Muslims who ask about this question. It's many people. But actually, we can see that this actually is not just a thing we explain away, but it's a beautiful thing. How can God be fully, purely loving in his essence? The Trinity. And we see that ultimately explained in the cross. There's a lot of religions that talk about a God of love. You see it in the Quran, certainly. That's an attribute given to God. But the question to ask of every religion is, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know God is loving? It's one thing if someone tells you over and over, I love you so much, but you don't see that love in action. How do you know it's really there? I think that's so powerful about the Christian faith. Instead of just giving you words about God's love, it gives you a story. And at the heart of that story is a cross. The way we answer these questions needs to point to the hope that we have. It needs to glow. It needs to draw people in. We need to major in the majors. Peter gets at this when he says, the way we make our defense should be a reason, but it needs to speak to the hope. That's what our heart is. We want to have people see the hope that we have. And the last point, I'm actually going to call up a guest speaker calling up a guest speaker to talk a bit about this last point. The last point is thinking about invitation. What does it mean to let our light shine? At some point, we need to invite people into talking more about faith, learning more about God, visiting a church, being part of that community. It's easy, I think, for us in the West to feel like no one becomes a Christian anymore, especially in a place like Toronto. So multicultural. We value our diversity. It's offensive to invite someone into something. It's just awkward. If I have a friend, will they come? Does anyone ever even become a Christian anymore? But I think this is a vital part of how Jesus lived. He invited people in, invited people into relationship. And so I want to call up Sandra. This is Jordan's lovely wife. And I just want to have Sandra share a bit of her story, her testimony, how she became a Christian. Well, I think this, that one, I got one. Oh, it should be good? Great. Yeah, I would just love to hear, Sandra, a little bit about your story. I say you didn't grow up in a Christian home, and would love to hear a bit about how you became Christian, but then also if there was a particular role played by invitation, what would that be? How did Christians invite you into the Christian community or to learn more about Jesus? How did that play a role?
Sure. So Logan asked me to do this an hour ago, so I hope this is coherent. But I grew up in British Columbia, so the west side of Canada. And I actually had Christian grandparents, and my parents sort of grew up in a Christian household, and then eventually walked away from that. And my mom ended up deciding to become an atheist, and my dad became kind of a pluralist in a sense. So my mom believed that there was no God, and my dad believed that there was all of the gods. So it was an interesting, that was sort of my biggest influences growing up, of course, my parents. And I gained a lot of good values from that. I mean, they taught us to be open, they taught us to listen to people, to consider people's stories, and give that value. But eventually, I ended up moving to Montreal to go to McGill for university. And when I moved to Montreal, there was only one person that I actually knew in Montreal. And she had been a girl who I went to high school with. I wasn't friends with her, I wasn't close to her, but we spent the first month of university completely together because we were the only people that one another knew at the beginning. And so she actually was a Christian, and at the time was a little bit shaky in her faith, but she wanted to join a Bible study. And she convinced me to go with her. And so it was the first Bible study I'd ever been to. It was through Power to Change. It was Campus for Christ at the time at McGill University. And I remember being surprised by a few things. So I'd grown up around Christians. I'd known Christians. I'd thought I knew what Christianity was. But in that Bible study, I think I got the most clear presentation of the gospel that I'd ever heard. So if we're talking about majoring in the majors, I think hearing the gospel, hearing this is what the cross means, this is why it's important, that was huge to me. Because otherwise, to me, it was this idea of Jesus died on a cross and now we're forgiven. And those can seem so disjointed to someone if they're not explained and connected and then shown how that's actually going to influence our lives today and influence the way that we act. And so that was incredible to me, to hear that. The other thing was the people that I was meeting. And these people were passionate about God, and they loved God, and it affected every area of their life, and they clearly wanted it to affect every area of their life. They weren't perfect, but they were trying to work out the gospel in every part of their lives. And I noticed that, and I was incredibly impressed by that. And so that led me to the question, well, it's compelling, but is it true? I wanted it to be true at that point. I wanted to believe in it, but I didn't know if I believed in it yet. I didn't know if it was verifiable. And so I asked a lot of questions, and people sat down with me, and people talked through my questions. And sometimes it was a passing comment. Sometimes it was a 3-hour coffee. Sometimes it was dinner. Sometimes it was just hanging out and talking. There was so many people involved in my walk and my questions, and so many people who cared enough to sit down. And I think each one of those people was important for me. For a while, my questions were very much about whether it was true. I remember one Bible study, though, sitting there, and we were talking about forgiveness. And we were talking about the passage when, I'm going to mess this up, but we were talking about the passage when one man is in debt to another, and he's in a huge debt, and he's forgiven of his debt, and then he won't forgive someone else who has a small debt to him. And it says, if you can't forgive, then you won't be forgiven. Something like that. It's a pretty strong statement in that passage. And that hit me. I was like, I'm not comfortable with that. And that seems strange, but the reason was, when I was in high school, my aunt had been murdered by her husband. And it had been a huge part of my family's. It had affected my family in so many different ways. And I knew that actually that uncle had become a Christian once he went to prison. And I knew that story. And I knew that I had never forgiven that. And in my head, it was, how could I be expected to forgive that? Or how could he be given that grace that I thought was so beautiful, the gospel that I thought was so beautiful for me, seemed horrendous to a man that had offended me. Again, it was intellectual, it was emotional, and people were willing to walk through those journeys with me, and that was a huge part of what was so significant for me. Another part of it was I came to this point where I felt like, you know what, the evidence is strong. I can believe this. I can see that there are strong arguments for Christianity. I actually think it's the most credible worldview that I've encountered. And I was talking to Christians. I was talking to my non-Christian friends at university. I was really actively trying to figure it out. And I believe that. I said, I think this is believable. I think it's rational, but my emotions felt like this. Like I would go a day when I'd be like, yes, I can believe in this. Yes, I can commit to it. And then I'd go a day when I was just plagued with doubts. And how could this be true? And I'd stand in a church service and think, is this real? Like, how could this be real? This is so out there. And someone said to me at that point, I think you should try praying. Like, have you been praying for faith? Have you been asking God to reveal himself to you? And so much of my journey had been very question-based and intellectually based that I thought, no, I have not been talking to God. I have not been trying that. And I did. And that, too, was transformative for me. That, too, made a huge difference. And so I'd say, in summing this up, in my takeaways, my journey was rational barriers, it was emotional barriers, it was experiencing God. It was so multifaceted and so long and drawn out. And I think in the relationships that I have with people who are questioning or unsure what they believe or trying to figure out what they believe or just believe completely different things to Christianity, in those relationships, I've seen people, it's often not linear, and I'll say it was not linear for me. That often we see people going towards God and then sometimes going away from God, and that can be incredibly discouraging. We can start to think, God's not working in this person's life like I thought he was. But I think we have to believe that God cares about that individual more than he cares about us, that he knows them and that he is drawing them to himself. And I'd say that the people that we think are apathetic, in my experience, I've rarely known an individual well who is truly apathetic. I'd say everyone has questions. Everyone cares about something, and that care is ultimately rooted in something that God has put in them, something good and something real, and something that can be used to draw them to God. I'd say every individual is ultimately built for God. They're built to know God. And so no one's at the core apathetic. And the second thing I want to say before I leave is, like what I said, every one of those people, every person who took the time to sit down with me made a difference in my life, made a difference in my journey to God. So don't underestimate what you can do by sitting down with someone and inviting them to a church service, to a Bible study, to whatever, because it does make a difference.
Thanks so much. It's great. Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that, Sandra. I think, as you said, I think it's just really interesting to hear how it all blends together. Like our lives are messy, and all of us, I think, are working out truth in the context of relationship and our family and our backgrounds and our experiences, and they all run together, and God works through them. But it's interesting to hear this is catalyzed by an invitation that you received to go to a Bible study. I think, it's like some people, we invite people sometimes and they don't come and we get discouraged, and yet God calls us to faithfulness, and he is working. This is so powerful to hear that in your story. I think that I just want to move into a time of closing by starting just to think about, what, let's say that you're here and you're like, okay, this has been a good, feel kind of convicted or guilty about, because I feel that way. Am I known for my love in my communities? Will my family look at me and say, Logan has this salt effect on our family? Am I present there? Do I have enough real relationships on my sports teams, outside my church, in school, where I'm actually present in people's lives, even in the ugly parts? Am I letting my light shine? Am I inviting people to things? How am I doing at that? I think this kind of message can be so crushing if we just take it all in like that. Or maybe you're here and you're like, we're talking about letting my light shine, but I don't feel like I have much of light anyway to give. God feels kind of far right now. I'm just thinking about like my own keeping my head above water. How can I think about sharing that with others? And I think that's real. I wonder, have you ever been to a movie theater for a movie you really like? And the movie ends, and you're sitting down in the chair, and the credits start to run. It's been an awesome movie, and you just are like sitting there, just enjoying it. And your friends get up and they're like, come on, let's go. And you're like, no. I just want to like sit in this moment of and why is that? It's because when we watch movies that move us, we like get brought into the story. And like we like feel like we're losing friends as it's ending. And like it's not that all of our problems are gone away in that moment, but it's just like a powerful movie. It just like it gives us a perspective. We transcend ourselves as we're watching it. We just want that moment to last. We just don't want to leave. And I think with the Christian faith, what you have is essentially a story. Humans are story-shaped people. Remember in like third grade when you learned that like story backgrounds, right? Like introduction, climax, then it like goes down and resolves. So like every single story has that same outline. Don't you think that humans would get more creative? We tell each other the same story over and over again. There is a Hollywood producer who wrote an article in The Atlantic, which is not a Christian publication. He's not a Christian, and he writes, I'm so sick of the same story being told in Hollywood. Even the movies that are like really hipster and edgy, the only reason why we go see those is because like the reaction we have to them when we're like, oh, that was a bad ending. It's only because we know the basic story that we realize the bad ending is weird. He's like, we're still controlled by this same narrative. And I think the Christian faith would say, especially someone like C.S. Lewis would say, the reason why that is because there's actually a story that's woven into the fabric of reality. The way that Lewis became a Christian was when a friend of his, Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, explained, you love stories so much. You love myths. I present to you the Christian faith as the true myth, the story that really happened. And it's not just a beautiful story. It's a story that involves us in it. I want you to imagine that, let's say after tonight, maybe tomorrow, so it's not dark, a few of us walk down to the lake, and we're just sort of enjoying. I'm American, so you're showing me Toronto, beautiful city. And we're walking alongside the lake. I begin feeling so just emotional. We have feelings, Americans, just feelings. And I'm just like, I'm so thankful for you guys. I'm like, you guys have shown me such love. I felt so welcomed here. I just want to show you how much I love you guys. I say that. Just like, I want to show you right now how much I love you. And I proceed to jump in the lake. I swim out as far as I can, and I drown. Are you guys going to like look at each other and be like, man, he loved us so much? No, you're going to be like, this guy's so crazy. How did we not see this earlier? It took us 2 days to see it. But let's change the story. Let's say that instead of me just swimming out in the lake, it's a really stormy day. One of you falls in. A current takes you out. I jump in and save you, but I drown in the process. Would that be loving? See, that changes the story. In the same way, many of us, when we think about Jesus dying on the cross, we think this is Jesus giving his life for humanity. But if it's just some random guy just dying, how is that loving? It's ridiculous. It's crazy. In the same way, the Christian story will only move us when we see it's not just Jesus dying for all people generally. It's him dying for us, for each of us, for you, that on one of the drops of blood he shed, there was your name on it. And when you see yourself written in that story, can you imagine living your life with that same feeling that you just have finished that movie and you're enraptured into it? This is what the Christian faith is. It's an invitation to write yourself into the story that actually happened, the true story, not just a fictional thing on the screen, but a story that really happened of a God who came and died for our sins to reconcile us to him. That is the invitation of the Christian faith. That is the invitation we extend. And what this means is when that story touches our hearts, that's how we get light inside of us. Because notice we read that Jesus says, you are the light of the world. But just a few chapters later, shortly later in the book of John, we read Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. We don't have light inside of us. How do we get that? How do we get that glow? It's by realizing that we're written into the story that has already been written on the pages of history. A God who's not just drowning in a lake for us, but a God who died for each of us personally to set us right with him. And I just want to close now with a story. There was a guy from my church growing up. He's passed away now, but he was a veteran in World War II. And he was captured in the war and was brought to a Japanese prison camp. And he tells this true story where every day the prisoners would be walked out and they would, dig trenches essentially. And then at the end of that, they'd sort of count everybody, make sure no one had run away. They'd count all the shovels to make sure no one brought it back in their tent so they could dig a hole and escape. And then they'd march back to camp. And he tells a story of how when he first arrived at the camp, even though most of the people there were Americans, they were all on the same side. There was just no unity among the prisoners at all. It was just scrounging for any scrap of food or scrap of clothes. It was just a free-for-all. It was just an awful environment. Everyone was on their own. Everyone was so bitter to one another, even though they were all Americans. They were all on the same team. There might have been some Canadians there. And he says one day when they went out to dig, and at the end of the day, they counted up the shovels, a shovel was missing. And so the guards sort of line everybody up, and they start asking, where's the shovel? Who took it? We got to know. They go around, they ask everybody. No one volunteers. No one took the shovel. And the guards begin to get furious. And one of them, he pulls out a pistol, and he's just livid, and he starts pointing the gun randomly at people. True story. At this point, a guy in the back raises his hands, and he says, I took the shovel. And he says it in such a calm but confident way, and the guard runs right up to him. And he's just so annoyed, so angry at this guy, the way he said it. He just begins to just take it out on this guy, starts punching him, takes the back of his rifle and just beats him into the ground. Everyone's watching. He actually beats this guy, and he ends up dying, beats him to death, leaves him there. The rest of the prisoners line up, they walk back to the camp. They get back to the camp, they're putting the shovels away. There's no shovel missing. They miscounted. This guy at my church said something changed in the camp that day. Before and after, night and day, you could trace it back to that moment. Seeing this guy, clearly he was innocent, didn't take anything. Offering his life, offering to be beaten down as an innocent person for the sake of all these strangers who he didn't know and who he was not bonding with. There was just such enmity and just everyone for themselves. When people saw that happen, they realized that this guy had died for them. It changed the demeanor of the camp. People began seeing each other, not just as competition for food, but actually as human beings worth that guy dying for. It changed the demeanor of that camp. And I think what the Christian faith envisions is a community like that has been changed by the death of one who didn't just die for a group of prisoners, a group of dozens of people, but who died for millions. He died for all of us who've put our trust in him. And when that moves us and touches our hearts, it affects also the way we see people outside of our church. We can't help just see them as just classmates anymore. These are people who've been bought for a price. Jesus has laid down his life so that they might have a relationship with him. And that changes us. When that touches our hearts, and we realize that it's us that he's been beaten down for, not just death on the cross, but cosmically taking the punishment of God. That'll move us, and we start to glow. And that's what we're inviting people into. And so just as we close, I want to just want to create a space for just us to pause before God and pray for a sec. I just want us to think about, we've talked about a lot of things. Jesus here gives us strong words. What it looks like to be Canadian, you're a polite and accepting person. Jesus says what it looks like to be a Christian, you should have salt in you to the point that you live such a life that's pure and committed to the good of others, that people see it. You're present there. You have real friendships. It's a life marked by light. You glow. You have a heart for people to know Christ. We don't do this perfectly. But there was one who did have that perfect love for us. And because he did, when we see that he died for us, we can too, because he touches and moves our hearts. So I just want to close now in prayer and have us think about who perhaps are the people who God has set on your heart. People who don't know him. People maybe who've gone to church but don't really come anymore. You just don't, or you just know that they're hurting. And you're like, I know this person has hard stuff going on, and I just haven't entered into their life. God does things so intentionally. Who are the people he's put in your life? I just want to close and have us think and pray about that. And then we'll hop back up for some Q&A and wrap up with some worship. But I just want to create space now, just between you and God, to think about that. What has he been saying to you from his word here? So I'll just pause for a few moments, and then I'll close in prayer. Dear God, we lift these people to you. Give us a heart for them. If we're not feeling the desire I know I should have for them to know you, please give us your love for these people, for these friends. Show us, give us opportunities to press into their lives, opportunities to put out bait, opportunities for us to be real about the faith, the role that you have in our lives. We pray, Lord, for opportunities for invitation. We know only you can change hearts, but we do pray that you would do that work. We thank you for the cross. Thank you for writing us into the most beautiful story ever told. Please help us to not cease being moved by it every day. In your son's name I pray.